All right, hey there. This is Jesse Johnson from Tutoring with a Twist. And it's been a little while, but I thought I would just continue reading Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. We're just going to pick up right where we left off. Um, so, where we were before, our protagonist, a young geologist, had just traveled a good ways out of his homeland in Germany to Denmark and was on a bit of a journey looking for a particular volcano in Iceland because he thought that it might be of some geological significance, or maybe at least his uncle did. So just picking up where we left off, we've got chapter 9, Iceland, but what's next? The day of our departure arrived. The day before that, our kind friend, Professor Thomson, had brought us letters of introduction to Count Trapp, the governor of Iceland, Mr. Picturson, the bishop's suffragan, and Mr. Finson, the mayor of Reykjavik. My uncle expressed his gratitude with the warmest of handshakes. On the second, at 6 o'clock in the morning, all our precious baggage had been safely stowed on board the Valkyrie. The captain led us to some very narrow cabins. Is the wind favorable? Asked my uncle. Excellent, replied Captain Bjarn. A southeasterly. We'll sail down the sound at full speed, with all sails set. In a few minutes the schooner, under her mizzen, brigantine, topsail, and topgallant sail, cast off from her moorings and sailed at full speed through the straits. In an hour the capital of Denmark seemed to sink below the distant waves, and the Valkyrie was skirting the coast near Elsinore. In my nervous frame of mind I half expected to see the ghost of Hamlet wandering on the legendary castle terrace. You magnificent fool, I said. No doubt you would approve of our expedition. Perhaps you would accompany us to the center of the globe to find the answers to your eternal doubts. But there was no ghostly shape on the ancient walls. In any case, the castle is much younger than the heroic Prince of Denmark. It now serves as a sumptuous lodge for the guardian of the Straits of the Sound, through which pass 15,000 ships of all nations every year. The castle of Kronborg soon disappeared in the mist, as well as the tower of Helsingborg on the Swedish coast, and the schooner passed lightly on her way, driven by the breezes of the Kattegat. The Valkyrie was a splendid ship, but on a sailing vessel you can never be sure what to expect. She was carrying coal to Reykjavik, and household goods, earthenware, woolen clothing, and a cargo of wheat. The crew consisted of 5 men, all Danes. How long will the passage take? Asked my uncle. 10 days, the captain replied, if we don't encounter a northwesterly while we're passing at the Faroes. But you aren't delayed much, are you? No, Mr. Lidenbrock, don't you worry. We'll get there in good time. Towards evening, the schooner rounded the Skaw at the northernmost point of Denmark, and then, during the night, crossed the Skagerrak, after which it skirted Norway with Cape Lindes to starboard and sailed into the North Sea. 2 days later, we sighted the coast of Scotland near Peterhead, and the Valkyrie turned to head towards the Faroe Islands, passing between Orkney and Shetland. Soon the schooner encountered the great Atlantic swell. She had to track against the northern wind, and reached the Faroes only with some difficulty. On the 8th, the captain made out Mykines, the westernmost of the islands, and then set a straight course for Cape Portland, the most southerly point of Iceland. Nothing unusual happened during the crossing. I wasn't troubled by seasickness. My uncle, on the other hand, to his great disgust and even greater shame, was ill for the whole voyage. He was therefore unable to talk to the captain about Snæfell, how to get to it, and what means of transport were available. He was obliged to put off these inquiries until our arrival, and spent the whole time stretched out in his cabin, the timbers of which creaked and shook with the pitching and tossing of the ship. I thought him not undeserving of this punishment. On the 11th, we reached Cape Portland. The clear weather gave us a good view of Myrdalsjökull, which towers over it. The cape is merely a low hill with steep sides, standing alone by the beach. The Valkyrie kept some distance from the coast, taking a westerly course amidst huge schools of whales and sharks. Soon we came in sight of an enormous rock with a hole in the middle of it, through which the sea crashed furiously. The Westman Islands seemed to rise out of the ocean, like rocks sown in a field of liquid. From that point on, the schooner kept full well out to sea and gave the land a wide berth as it rounded Cape Reykjanes, which forms the westernmost point of Iceland. The rough sea prevented my uncle from coming up on deck to admire these battered and wind-beaten coastlands. 48 hours later, coming out of a storm which had forced the schooner to sail under bare masts, we caught sight to the east of us of the beacon on Skagen Point, where dangerous rocks stretch far out to sea. An Icelandic pilot came on board, and in 3 hours the Valkyrie dropped anchor close to Reykjavik, in Faxa Bay. The professor at last emerged from his cabin, rather pale and wretched looking, but full of enthusiasm, and with a look of satisfaction on his face. The population of the town, thrilled by the arrival of a vessel from which everyone expected something, formed in groups on the quay. My uncle hastened to leave his floating prison, or rather hospital, but before leaving the deck of the schooner, he dragged me over, and pointing north of the bay to a distant mountain that formed a double peak, a pair of cones covered with perpetual snow, he shouted, "Snaefell! That's Snaefell!" When motioning to me to say something about our secret, he got into the boat that was waiting for him. I followed, and soon we were standing on the very soil of Iceland. The first man we saw was a decent-looking fellow in a general's uniform. But he wasn't a general, just a magistrate, the governor of the island, Baron Tramp himself. The professor realized at once who he was dealing with. He handed over his letters from Copenhagen, and then there followed a short conversation in Danish, which, for a very good reason, I took no part in. But the result of this first conversation was that Baron Tramp placed himself entirely at the disposal of Professor Lidenbrock. My uncle was just as courteously received by the mayor, Mr. Finson, whose appearance was just as military, and whose temperament and function just as peaceful as the governor's. As for the bishop suffragan, Mr. Picturson, he was at that moment engaged in an episcopal visit to the north, so we would just have to wait for the honor of being presented to him. But Mr. Fredriksson, the science teacher at the Reykjavik school, was a delightful man, and his help became very important to us. This humble scholar spoke only Icelandic and Latin, and he came and offered us his assistance in the language of Horace. I felt we were well suited to understanding each other. In fact, he was the only person in Iceland with whom I could converse at all. This good-natured gentleman gave us the use of 2 of the 3 rooms in his house, and we were soon installed there with all our luggage, the quantity of which rather astonished the good people of Reykjavik. "Well, Axel," said my uncle, "we're getting on. Now the worst is over." "The worst?" I said, astonished. "Oh, to be sure. Now we have nothing to do but go down." "Oh, if that's all, you're quite right. But nevertheless, when we're gone down, we'll have to climb up again, won't we?" "Oh, I'm not worried about that. Come on, there's no time to lose. I'm going to the library. Perhaps there's some manuscript of Saknusson's there, and I'd like to consult it." "Well, while you're there, I'll go into town. Won't you come too?" "Oh, that doesn't interest me at all. It's not what's on this island, but what's beneath it that interests me." I went out and wandered wherever chance took me. It would be hard to get lost in Reykjavik's 2 streets. I therefore had no need to ask the way, something that can easily lead to confusion when your only means of asking is by gesture. The town stretches out along low, marshy ground between 2 hills. On one side there is an immense bed of lava, sloping gently towards the sea. On the other side is the vast spread of Faxa Bay, bordered to the north by the huge Snaefell Glacier. The Valkyrie was at the time the only occupant of the bay. Usually, English and French fisheries protection vessels moor there, but just then they were patrolling the eastern coasts of the island. The longer of the only 2 streets in Reykjavik runs parallel to the beach. Here the merchants and traders live, in wooden cabins made of red planks set horizontally. The other street, running west, leads to a little lake and passes between the house of the bishop and the other people who are not involved in trade. I had soon explored these depressing streets. Here and there I got a glimpse of faded glass, looking like a worn-out bit of carpet, or of a kitchen garden of sorts, the sparse vegetables of which, potatoes, cabbages, and lettuces, would have been suitable for a table in Lilliput. A few sickly wallflowers were trying to enjoy the air and sunshine. About halfway along the non-commercial street, I found the public cemetery, enclosed by a mud wall, and where there seemed to be plenty of room. Then, a few steps brought me to the governor's house. Nothing much to look at compared with the town hall in Hamburg, but a palace in comparison with the huts of the people of Iceland. Situated between the little lake and the town, the church is built in the Protestant style, of calcined stones which the volcanoes themselves supply. It was obvious that in the strong, westerly winds the red tiles of the roof would be scattered in the air, to the great danger of the faithful worshippers. On a neighboring hill, I spotted the National School, where, as I was later informed by our host, were taught Hebrew, English, French, and Danish, 4 languages of which, I confess with shame, I knew not one word. In an exam, I would have come last among the 40 scholars being educated at this little college, and I would have been held unworthy to sleep with them in one of those little double closets where more delicate youths would have died of suffocation on the very first night. In 3 hours, I had seen not only the town but its surroundings. The general appearance of the place was very dismal. No trees and scarcely any vegetation. Everywhere bare rocks, the signs of volcanic activity. The Icelandic cottages are made of earth and turf, and the walls slope inward. They rather resemble roofs placed on the ground, but these roofs are meadows of comparative fertility. Thanks to the heat from inside, grass grows on them quite well. It is carefully mown in the haymaking season, otherwise the horses, cows, and sheep would come and graze on these lush, green houses. During my walk, I only met a few people, and returning to the main street, I found the greater part of the population busy drying, salting, and loading cod, their main export. These men were robust and heavy, like blond Germans with pensive eyes, conscious of being far removed from the rest of humanity. Poor exiles relegated to this land of ice, poor creatures who should have been Eskimos since nature had condemned them to live just outside the Arctic Circle. I tried in vain to detect a smile on their faces. Sometimes they seemed to laugh by a spasmodic and involuntary contraction of the muscles, but they never smiled. Their clothing consisted of a coarse jacket of black woolen cloth, known as vadmel in Scandinavian countries, a hat with a very broad rim, trousers trimmed with narrow red ribbon, and bits of leather rolled round their feet by way of shoes. The women looked as sad and resigned as the men. Their faces were pleasant but expressionless, and they wore dresses and petticoats of dark vadmel. If unmarried, they wore over their braided hair a little knitted brown cap. When married, they put a colored kerchief round their heads, crowned with a peak of white linen. After a good walk, I returned to Mr. Frederickson's house, where I found my uncle in the company of his host. Chapter 10. Interesting Conversations with Icelandic Scholars. Dinner was ready. Professor Liedenbrock was devouring his platefuls with relish, and his forced fast on board the ship had turned his stomach into a vast, unfathomable gulf. The meal was more Danish than Icelandic, and was nothing remarkable in itself, but the hospitality of our host reminded me of the heroes of old. It seemed to me that we were more at home than he was himself. The conversation was carried on in the local language, which, for my benefit, my uncle interspersed with German, and Mr. Frederickson with Latin. It was mostly about matters of science, as is quite fitting for scientists. But Professor Liedenbrock was very reserved, and at every sentence his eyes indicated that I should say absolutely nothing regarding our plans. First, Mr. Frederickson wanted to know what success my uncle had had at the library. "Your library? Why, there's nothing there but a few tattered books on almost empty shelves." "What?" replied Mr. Frederickson. Why, we have 8,000 volumes, many of them valuable and rare, works in the old Scandinavian language. And we have all the new books that Copenhagen sends us every year. Where do you keep your 8,000 volumes? As far as I could see, oh, Mr. Lidenbrock, they're all over the country. We're fond of study in this icy region. There's not a farmer or fisherman who cannot read and does not read. Our principle is that books, instead of growing moldy behind an iron grating, should be worn out under the eyes of many readers. So these books are passed from one person to another, read over and over again, and referred to again and again. And it often happens that they only find their way back to their shelves after an absence of a year or two. And in the meantime, said my uncle, rather spitefully, strangers, well, what would you have us do? Foreigners have their libraries at home, and the essential thing for working people is that they should be educated. I say again, the love of reading runs in Icelandic blood. In 1816, we founded a prosperous literary society. Learned foreigners consider themselves honored to become members of it. It publishes books which educate our fellow countrymen and do the country a great service. It would give us immense pleasure if you would agree to be a corresponding member, Mr. Lidenbrock. My uncle, who had already joined about 100 learned societies, accepted with a grace which clearly touched Mr. Frederickson. Now, he said, if you will be kind enough to tell me what books you hope to find in our library, I may assist you to consult them. My uncle's eyes met mine. He hesitated. This direct question went to the very heart of the matter. But, after a moment's reflection, he decided to speak. Mr. Frederickson, I wanted to know if amongst your ancient books you possessed any of the works of Arne Seknussemm. Arne Seknussemm, you mean that learned 16th century scholar, naturalist, chemist, and traveler? Exactly. One of the glories of Icelandic literature and science. That's the man. An illustrious man anywhere, quite so. And whose courage was equal to his genius. I see you know him well. My uncle was absolutely delighted to hear his hero so described. He was feasting his eyes on Mr. Frederickson. Well, he cried, where are his works? His works? We don't have any of his works. What, not in Iceland? Neither in Iceland nor anywhere else. Why is that? Because Arne Seknussemm was persecuted for heresy, and in 1573 his books were burned by the common hangman. Good, excellent, exclaimed my uncle, quite shocking the science teacher. What? He said. Yes, it's all clear now. It's all making sense. I see why Seknussemm put into the index of prohibited books, and forced to conceal the discoveries made by his genius, was obliged to bury in an incomprehensible cryptogram the secret. What secret? Asked Mr. Frederickson with great interest. Oh, just a secret which, stammered my uncle. Have you some private document in your possession? Asked our host. No, I was just imagining a possibility. Oh, I see, answered Mr. Frederickson, who was kind enough not to pursue the subject when he had noticed his friend's embarrassment. I hope you won't leave our island until you have seen some of its mineralogical wealth. Certainly, replied my uncle, but I'm rather a latecomer. Or have others not been here before me? Oh, yes, Mr. Lidenbrock. The work of Olafson and Pulverson, undertaken by order of the king, the researchers of Troy, the scientific mission of Gaimard and Robert on the French corvette La Rochelle, and lately the observation of scientists who came in the Reine Hortense, have added a great deal to our knowledge of Iceland. But I assure you there is still plenty to do. Do you think so? Said my uncle, pretending to look very modest and trying to hide the curiosity that was glinting in his eyes. Oh, yes. There are many mountains, glaciers, and volcanoes left to study, as yet imperfectly known. For example, without getting any further, that mountain on the horizon, that's Snæfell. Oh, said my uncle, as calmly as he was able. Is that Snæfell? Yes, one of the most unusual volcanoes, whose crater has scarcely ever been visited. Is it extinct? Oh, yes, for more than 500 years. Well, replied my uncle, who was frantically locking his legs together to keep himself from leaping in the air, that is where I mean to begin my geological studies. There on that snaffle. Fressel, what do you call it? Snaffle, replied the worthy Mr. Fridriksson. This part of the conversation was in Latin. I had understood every word of it, and I could hardly conceal my amusement at seeing my uncle trying to control the excitement and satisfaction that were absolutely dripping off him. He tried hard to put on the innocent little expression of simplicity, but it looked like a diabolical grin. Yes, he said, your words have made up my mind for me. We'll try to climb that snake. Perhaps we may even carry out our studies in its crater. I'm very sorry, said Mr. Fridriksson, that my commitments will not allow me to take time off, or I would have come with you myself, for both pleasure and profit. Oh, no, 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 replied my uncle with great animation. We wouldn't for the world put anyone out, Mr. Fridriksson. Still, I thank you with all my heart. The company of such a talented man would have been very useful, but the duties of your profession. I'm glad to think that our host, innocent Icelandic soul that he was blind to my uncle's blatant trickery. I very much approve of your beginning with that volcano, Mr. Lidenbrock. You will gather a harvest of interesting observations. But tell me, how do you expect to get to the Snaefell Peninsula? By sea, across the bay. That's the most direct way. No doubt, but it's impossible. Why? Because we don't have a single boat at Reykjavik. Drat it. You'll have to go by land, along the shore. It'll be a longer journey, but more interesting. Very well, then. But I'll have to see about a guide. I'll have one to offer you. A sensible, intelligent man? Yes, someone who lives on that peninsula. He is a collector of eider down, and very clever. He speaks Danish perfectly. When can I see him? Tomorrow, if you like. Why not today? Because he won't be here till tomorrow. Tomorrow, then, agreed my uncle, with a sigh. This momentous conversation ended a few moments later, with warm thanks from the German professor to the Icelandic teacher. My uncle had at this dinner gained important information, amongst other things the story of Saknussemm, the reason for the mysterious document, that his host would not be accompanying him on his expedition, and that the very next day a guide would be at his hospital. Chapter 11. The Finding of a Guide to the Center of the Earth. In the evening, I took a short walk along the beach, and came back early to my plank bed, where I slept soundly all night. When I awoke, I heard my uncle talking volubly in the next room. I immediately got dressed and joined him. He was talking Danish to a tall man of robust build. This fine fellow clearly possessed great strength. His eyes, set in a large and ingenuous face, seemed to me very intelligent. They were of a dreamy sea blue. Long hair, which would have been called red even in England, fell in long strands over his broad shoulders. The movements of this native were lithe and supple, but he made little use of his arms when speaking, like a man who knew nothing or cared nothing about the language of gestures. His whole appearance bespoke perfect calmness and self-possession, not laziness and tranquillity. I felt at once that he would be beholden to nobody, that he worked for his own convenience, and that nothing in this world would astonish him or disturb his philosophic calmness. I caught these hints of this Icelander's character by the way he listened to the professor's impassioned flow of words. He stood with arms crossed, perfectly unmoved by my uncle's incessant gesticulations. The negative was expressed by a slow movement of the head from left to right, and affirmative by a slight bend, so slight that his long hair scarcely moved. He took economy of movement almost to the level of shabbiness. Looking at this man, I would certainly never have dreamt that he was a hunter. While he didn't look likely to frighten the game, it didn't seem likely that he would even get near it. But the mystery was solved when Mr. Fridriksson informed me that this quiet man was only hunted eiderduck, whose underplumage constitutes the chief wealth of the island. This is the celebrated eider down, and it requires no great rapidity of movement to get it. Early in the summer, the female eider, a very pretty bird, goes to build her nest among the rocks of the fjords with which the coast is fringed. After building the nest, she lines it with down plucked from her own breast. Immediately, the hunter, or rather the trader, comes and robs the nest, and the female starts her work all over again. This goes on as long as she has any down left. When she has stripped herself bare, the male eider takes his turn to pluck himself. But since the coarse, hard plumage of the male has no commercial value, the hunter doesn't bother to rob the nest. The female, therefore, lays her eggs in the spoils of her mate, the young are hatched, and the next year the harvest begins again. Now, as the eider duck does not choose steep cliffs for her nest, but rather the smooth, terraced rocks which slope down to the sea, the Icelandic hunter is able to exercise his calling without any inconvenient exertion. He is a farmer, who is not obliged either to sow or reap his harvest, but merely to gather it in. This grave, phlegmatic, and silent individual was called Hans Bjelke, and he became recommended by Mr. Fridriksson. He was to be our guide. His manners were in singular contrast with my uncle's. Nevertheless, they soon came to understand each other. Neither considered the size of the payment. The one was ready to accept whatever was offered, the other was ready to give whatever was asked. Never was a bargain more easily concluded. The result of the agreement was that Hans undertook on his part to take us to the village of Stapi on the south shore of the Snæfell Peninsula, the very foot of the volcano. By land, this would be about 22 miles. Walkable, said my uncle, in 2 days. But when he learned that a Danish mile is 24,000 feet, he was obliged to modify his calculations and allow 7 or 8 days for the journey. 4 horses were to be placed at our disposal, 2 to carry my uncle and myself, 2 for the baggage. Hans, as was his custom, would go on foot. He knew the whole part of that journey perfectly, and promised to take us by the shortest route. His engagement was not to end when we arrived at Stapi. He was to continue in my uncle's service for the whole period of his scientific research, for 3 riksdaler a week, but it was expressed article of the contract that his wages should be paid to him every Saturday evening at 6 o'clock. This, according to him, was an indispensable part of the agreement. The start was fixed for the 16th of June. My uncle wanted to pay the hunter part of the wages in advance, but he refused with one word. After, he said. Afterwards, said my professor, for my edification. The arrangement concluded, Hans silently withdrew. An excellent fellow, exclaimed my uncle, but little does he know the wonderful role he is about to play in the future. So he used to accompany us as far as the center of the earth, Axel. There were still 48 hours to go before we to set off. To my great regret, I had to spend the whole time preparing for the trip, as it took all our ingenuity to pack every article in the best way. Scientific instruments here, firearms there, tools in this package, provisions in that. 4 sets of packages in all. The scientific instruments were 1. An Eigel centigrade thermometer graduated up to 150 degrees, which seemed to me either too much or too little. Too much if the heat of the earth was to rise as high as that, for in that case we would be baked alive, but not enough to measure the temperature of hot springs or any matter in a state of fusion. A manometer, to indicate extreme pressures of the atmosphere. An ordinary barometer would not have served the purpose, as the pressure would increase during our descent to a point where a mercury barometer wouldn't register. Third, a chronometer made by Vossius Jr. of Geneva, accurately set to the meridian of Hamburg. 4, 2 compasses, one showing inclination, the other declination. 5, a night telescope. And 6, 2 Ruhmkorff apparatuses, which, by means of an electric current, would provide a safe and handy portable light. The firearms consisted of 2 Purdley Moore rifles and 2 Colt revolvers. What did we want guns for? We had neither savages nor wild beasts to fear, as far as I could see, but my uncle seemed as attached to his arsenal as much as to his instruments, and more especially to a considerable quantity of gun cotton, which is unaffected by moisture, and the explosive force of which exceeds that of gunpowder. The tools consisted of 2 pickaxes, 2 spades, a silk ladder, 3 iron-tipped sticks, an axe, a hammer, a dozen iron wedges and spikes, and a long, knotted rope. This made for a large load, as the ladder itself was 300 feet long. And there were provisions, too. This wasn't a large bundle, but it was comforting to know that we were taking a 6-month supply of dried beef and biscuits. The only liquid was spirits. We weren't taking any water with us, but we had flasks, and my uncle was depending on springs where we would be able to fill them. Whatever objections I raised about the quality, temperature, or even absence of such springs were to no avail. To complete the inventory of what we were taking with us, I mustn't forget to mention a pocket medicine chest containing blunt scissors, splints for broken limbs, unbleached linen tape, bandages and compresses, lint, and a lancet for bleeding, each thing frightening in its implications. Then there was a row of little boxes containing dextrin, medical alcohol, lead acetate solution, ether, vinegar, and sal ammoniac. These, too, afforded me no comfort. Finally, we had everything needed to power the Ruhmkorff apparatuses. My uncle hadn't forgotten a supply of tobacco, coarse-grained gunpowder, and tinder, not a leather belt in which he carried an adequate supply of gold, silver, and paper money. 6 pairs of boots and shoes, made waterproof with a composition of India rubber and tar, were packed among the tools. Clothed, shod, and equipped like this, said my uncle, there's no telling how far we might go. The whole of the 14th was spent in organizing all these different articles. In the evening, we dined with Baron Tramp, the mayor of Reykjavik, and Dr. Halyatin, the chief medical officer. They were also present. Mr. Frederickson wasn't there. I learned afterwards that he and the governor disagreed over some question of administration and didn't speak to each other. I, therefore, understood not a single word of what was said at the semi-official dinner, but I couldn't help noticing that my uncle talked the whole time. On the 15th, our preparations were complete. Our host delighted the professor by presenting him with a map of Iceland, far more complete than Henderson's one. It was a map drawn by Olaf Nicholas Olsen on a scale of 1 to 480,000, and published by the Icelandic Literary Society. Based on the geodesic work of Schiel Frisak and the topological survey carried out by Bjorn Gulemsgusson, it was a precious document for a mineralogist. Our final evening was spent in close conversation with Mr. Frederickson, for whom I felt the warmest regard. After our chat, I, at least, had a disturbed and restless night. At 5 in the morning, I was wakened by the neighing and stamping of 4 horses, right below my window. I dressed quickly and went down into the street. Hans was finishing our packing, almost as it were, without moving a limb, and yet he did his work skillfully. My uncle was making a lot of noise to little purpose, and the guide seemed to be paying very little attention to his energetic instructions. At 6 o'clock, our preparations were finished. Mr. Frederickson shook hands with us. My uncle thanked him warmly in Icelandic for his extreme kindness. I made up a few fine Latin sentences to express my cordial farewell. Then we mounted our horses, and with his last goodbye, Mr. Frederickson treated me to a line of Virgil eminently applicable to such uncertain wanderers as we were likely to be. Et quod commune viam dederit fortuna sequamur. So chapter 12 is a barren land, but we're going to have to skip it today. We'll continue this later. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll catch you next time.